week we're going to look at cerebral palsy and its impact on communication. Cerebral palsy is difficulty controlling voluntary movement, and it's a result of damage to the brain or malformation of the brain that occurs before, during, or up to 2 years after birth. Let's do a brief overview of cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy is lifelong. There is no cure for cerebral palsy. An individual with CP will always have CP. However, early detection and treatment can help alleviate symptoms and can help individuals possibly achieve full independence, depending on their capabilities. There are 4 types of cerebral palsy. The first type is spastic cerebral palsy, and spastic cerebral palsy is actually the most common of all 4 types. It occurs in 80% of the individuals who have cerebral palsy, and it can occur with other forms of cerebral palsy. It's associated with damage to upper motor neurons or secondary damage in the cortical spinal tract and in the motor cortex. It's characterized by muscle rigidity and stiffness. The second type of cerebral palsy is athetoid cerebral palsy. And athetoid cerebral palsy is characterized by involuntary movement and uncontrolled movement. The person may have difficulty in reaching for objects. They may overshoot what they're reaching for. They may have some head jerking or postural concerns. And it is associated with damage in the basal ganglia. The third kind of cerebral palsy is ataxic cerebral palsy, and this is characterized primarily by difficulties with balance. So individuals will have difficulty in walking and safely navigating their environment, and it's associated with damage to the cerebellum. And then finally, the fourth type is mixed cerebral palsy, and that is a combination of the other forms of CP. Cerebral palsy looks different in everybody. It can range from very mild symptoms to very severe symptoms. Only one side of the body may be affected, or it could affect both sides of the body. Cerebral palsy may affect only the lower limbs or the upper limbs, or all 4 of the limbs could be involved. If the muscles of speech are involved, the vocal cords, the facial muscles, tongue and lips, and the muscles of respiration, then speech will be affected, and expressive language could also possibly be affected. Not necessarily because of the cerebral palsy in terms of the brain damage, but in terms of the motor implications on speech. So if an individual has a hard time producing speech, then their expressive language may be limited to single word utterances. They may only choose to use vocabulary that they're sure other people will understand, so it may seem like they have less of a vocabulary than they actually do. Also with cerebral palsy, concomitant intellectual disability or learning disability are more common than would occur in the general population. And this can affect receptive language, which is the individual's ability to understand what they hear or read. So this is just a little comparison. This individual here has spastic cerebral palsy. You can see in his upper limbs the rigidity and the tension in his arms, as opposed to over here, where this person has athetoid cerebral palsy. They're having trouble maintaining posture in their chair. It looks like their arm may have come across their body. So just a quick look at that. Let's look at the communication characteristics for individuals with cerebral palsy. The implication of cerebral palsy on communication, there can be no involvement at all. If only the lower limbs are involved in the cerebral palsy, then communication may not be impacted at all. Or you could have very significant impact on communication to the extent that the individual may not have intelligible verbal language at all and may rely on another means of communicating. Developmental dysarthria is probably the most common communication characteristic associated with cerebral palsy. And it's the difficulty that children with neuromotor or neuromuscular disorder have in producing speech that is understandable to the general population. And what I mean by general population is, can anybody understand this child? Or is it only people who are very familiar with them, that are used to speaking with them on a regular basis, and that would have a lot of information about that child that can understand them? So can the child walk up to an unfamiliar listener and be easily understood and easily have their wants and needs met? Developmental dysarthria can involve respiration. It can involve your voice, as voice is produced by muscles in the larynx. And it can involve the specific sounds of speech themselves. So, difficulty with respiration. If involvement of muscles of respiration can result in poor breath support, irregular and rapid breathing patterns, and then weak breath support can have the following effects. You'll have short, choppy utterances. The choppy utterances could result from speaking toward the end of an exhale. When we inhale and then go to speak, we generally speak at the beginning of the exhale, and we have that whole long breath on which to talk. If we started to speak at the end of the exhale, then we only have a very little bit of breath to power our speech, and this is going to result in shorter and choppier utterances and in pauses where they shouldn't be. So you may have pauses that are too long because they're waiting to talk until the middle of that exhale, and you're going to have pauses in inappropriate places. Difficulty with phonation, and by phonation I mean adding voice to the breath. You're going to have difficulty initiating voice. So this will be a result of spasticity in the muscles holding the vocal cords closed. So if the vocal cords are very tense and very tight, it's going to be hard to force them open with the airstream, and so an individual will have difficulty starting to speak. And once again, this is going to result in pauses in speech that are too long or inappropriate places. And then there will be difficulty producing the sounds of speech themselves. Speech is a motor act, like we talked about in the first week, and each speech sound is associated with a different movement pattern. So difficulty moving the lips and poor lip closure will lead to sounds such as P, B, M, F, and W being impacted, the sounds being P, B, M, F, W. And V should be in there too, the V sound. Restricted tongue movements could lead to difficulty producing sounds such as T, J, S, Z, Ch, J, K, G, F. These are all sounds that are made primarily with your tongue, touching your tongue to different places in your mouth. Also, there is an inability in cerebral palsy often to build up pressure in your mouth, and certain sounds require a certain amount of pressure in order to be produced, and those sounds are listed right there. So essentially, depending on the extent of motor impairment, sounds may either be completely omitted from speech, or they could just be distorted in their production. So the individual is trying to produce the sounds. They may be overshooting the movement pattern. They may not be producing enough pressure in their mouth to quite produce the sound properly. So even though they're trying for the sound, it doesn't come out sounding quite the way that it should. Here is an example of a little guy who has developmental dysarthria. If you notice, he pauses in inappropriate places, he uses shorter phrases, and he has several sound distortions. Where did he go? Let's try again. There we go.
Daniel.
He started.
Daniel, look at Daniel.
He's having trouble.
What's your name?
Looking at the camera.
My name is Stefan.
Good job. Can you look at Amy and say it?
My name is Stefan.
How old are you?
I'm
Are you two?
How many fingers is that?
Good. Two? Wow.
I am
Good boy.
Yes.
You say, I love you, Amy. Stop being distracted by the TV. Say, I love you and Amy. Just say Amy.
me.
There you go.
Yay.
There you go.
No.
You don't want to use that thing?
So you'll notice his voice is not very strong. There's not a lot of inflection. He's not varying his pitch or his volume very much as he's talking. His phrases are shorter and he's got some distortions in his sounds. And he's pausing after each word, probably as a result of weak breath support. So that's what developmental dysarthria looks like. And that's the motor implication of cerebral palsy on speech. Expressive language can also be impacted in a variety of ways. The individual could be completely nonverbal. Motor impairment can be such that an individual is nonverbal or only has the ability to produce a few single word utterances. And in this case, the individual may rely completely on an alternative form of communication for expressive language. The problem with some of these alternative forms of communication is that they rely on either touch screens or a keyboard input or something that also would require some fine motor control in the hands. And often when speech is impacted, then fine motor control of the hands is impacted as well. So you'll be looking at different ways of selection, such as eye gaze, maybe using a joystick, maybe using a rolling mouse. And there are some creative ways of doing that. If the individual is verbal, you might notice a reduced length of utterance. Limited mobility will limit the number of words that an individual will be able to produce in one utterance. As I said, each speech sound is made by a specific movement pattern, and combining lots of those speech sounds together means you're combining lots of movement patterns together. And that can be problematic for individuals with cerebral palsy. As a result, speech can therefore sound stilted and slow, just like you saw that little boy. And vocabulary may be impacted. Individuals may stick with words that they know they are able to produce or will be understood by his or her listener. They may get frustrated repeating themselves. They may feel self-conscious. So they're going to stick with things that they know they can say and that they know that other people will understand. Receptive language, unless there's a concomitant intellectual disability or specific language impairment, understanding of language generally is not impacted by cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy is a motor disorder. Let's look at some communication strategies. Some individuals with cerebral palsy will require no modifications in communication, and others may be completely nonverbal and rely on alternative ways of communicating. So you're going to see a huge spectrum of communication abilities in individuals with cerebral palsy. The first thing you want to do is allow plenty of time. Make sure you're giving your client ample time to form thoughts and respond to questions. Once again, people are very uncomfortable with long pauses in conversation or long silences. But individuals with CP often have a slower rate of speech or pause in inappropriate places due to poor muscle control. By allowing extra time, you're going to give someone the ability to express him or herself better. The other thing you want to do is try not to finish a thought for the person with cerebral palsy and try not to interrupt. Be an active listener. You want to make good eye contact. Use body language such as nodding and leading into your communication partner to encourage continued communication. Communicating can be really frustrating for people who know what they want to say and who understand that they have a hard time getting their point across. So you really want to make sure you're encouraging your communication partner to continue attempting and to continue trying to communicate with you. You want to check to make sure you've understood, and one of the ways you can do this is to repeat back what you heard and ask for confirmation. Use visual cues if necessary. Use those objects, use those photos, use pictures to offer choices. Once again, offering choices lets people who don't often typically have much control over their situation to have a little bit of control. And this is really empowering, and it's going to reinforce the idea that you care about their wants and needs, and it's going to help you build a rapport with your client. You can encourage your client to use objects or pictures in the environment to facilitate your ability to understand him or her. If they're capable of using gestures, this can also be encouraged. And then technology, like I said, individuals with significant CP will often have some form of alternative communication. If they do, you want to get in touch with your client's speech therapist and ask them to program a specific page for if you're an OT, a PT, a social worker, for a specific page geared for your sessions. Um, you could have the speech therapist teach you to program these things. Or if you have an iPad, you can find a free app that will work for basic needs or for whatever service you provide. But once again, you want to be mindful of selection because often individuals who have speech difficulties as a result of cerebral palsy will also have fine motor involvement of the hands. And that is just some suggestions in cerebral palsy.